You're welcome back again. We take up the story of Therese. Last time I spoke about the time she was living in the stirring times and revolutionary times, and that the intellectual atmosphere that was going on outside the convent. One thing I should have mentioned as we moved to talk about her life in the convent that she entered in 1887 or thereabouts, 1888, I should mention that every sister in the convent, in her room under the bed, had a small suitcase with lay clothes in case they were thrown out of the convent. Remember, I'd said that over 261 convents were closed around about that time. The Carmelites felt they lived under that threat, so that we bear that in mind as we talk about it. So what was life like in the convent at the time that Therese entered? Well, for a start, and most unusually, there were 5 members of her family in the convent, which is most unusual. So we have 4 sisters and 1 cousin. One mistake, one criticism made of the convent at the time she entered was that the rule of silence, which is fairly strict, was not kept at certain times of the day, or depending, because what would happen is if a sister had a visit with someone in the parlour, someone from outside, family members from the town or whatever, sometimes gossip was exchanged in passing in the cloister. The rest of the time, of course, the convent was under silence. When Therese entered, there were few novices. There was a possibility she could have been indulged and petted and not received very good training at the beginning of her religious life and its demands, but in this case that did not happen. The prioress was a lady, a very formidable aristocratic lady called Marie de Gonzague, and by all accounts a formidable personality with a strong temperament. And Therese had nothing but the utmost respect for this lady and felt that she benefited from her criticism of her, which she did not spare her. We know that from Therese's own writing and from others' observations, when the bell rang, Therese stopped whatever she was doing and she obeyed and went on to whatever the rules said was the next, whether it was going to the chapel, whether it was going to do your chores. She obeyed it, dropped whatever she was doing, and she moved on. For over half the year, the sisters only had 1 meal a day, and the building was unheated, largely unheated. There was 1 room with heat in the winter, and there, of course, was no electricity. The sisters read by oil lamps and negotiated the dark corridors or their rooms with oil lamps. Summer or winter, they wore a very heavy woolen habit and clothing, and it never changed whether they were sweltering in the summer or freezing in the winter. It made no difference. You wore the same religious habit. We know from Therese herself and from others, she suffered intensely from the cold and from chilblains, and later, as we'll discover, from continuous kind of sore throat and hoarseness in her voice. As I say, officially conversation was limited to an hour of the day, and that was until recreation, an hour in the evening. Solitude ruled for the rest, with that little exception that I made earlier. Everyone in the convent took their part in doing the laundry, cleaning the house, and serving at table and clearing up. Sleep was limited most of the year to 5.5 hours a day, and the rule, of course, covered every aspect of the day, and there was no free time included in the timetable. It was a large community. When Therese entered, there were about 23 women living in the convent. Later, when her sister Celine entered, she brought a camera, very unusual again, And there is a famous photograph of 26 people, including the lay sisters who looked after the visitors and the provisions. They're included in the photograph. So this was a large community full of diverse personalities and temperaments, and Therese made great efforts to befriend everyone, especially the most awkward and sullen types, which she always met everyone with a ready smile, and she practiced never taking offense when people were rude and ignorant, and she studiously avoided judging anyone. Naturally, some people knew her better than others, like the novices, because Mother de Gonzague asked her to help with their training on a regular basis. She was never called the novice mistress, but she was employed in that role and in training the novices. Therese always strove to avoid drawing attention to herself, but she was totally uncompromising when it came to telling the truth and being truthful. She didn't take offense at novices' behavior or their crassness or their rudeness. She was a straight shooter, and when dealing with the novices in her charge, she never sought to flatter or ingratiate herself with them. As I say, she preferred honesty and truth, and that was exactly the way that she dealt with herself and with her own faults and shortcomings. Here's one of the few descriptions we have of Therese, aged 20 years of age, and it comes from Mother de Gonzague. Tall and strong, with the appearance of a child, a tone of voice and expression, hiding within her a wisdom, a perfection, a perspicacity of a 50-year-old. Little innocent thing, to whom one would give to God without confession, but whose head is full of mischief to play on anyone she pleases. Mystic, comic, everything. She can make you weep with devotion, and just as easy split your sides with laughter during our recreation. That's a wonderful picture of this multifaceted, rounded character of Therese. No plaster saint at all. We know that within her heart and from her writing, we know even better, Therese had a tremendous missionary heart, even within the enclosure of Carmel. She particularly prayed for missionary priests and for the people to whom they administered. At the time that Therese entered, there was a nun in the convent, in the community, who had been posted to Saigon before returning to Vietnam in 1895. At one time, of course, Therese herself was among the first to volunteer to go to Saigon with volunteers when volunteers were being sought from the community. From 1886 until her death in 1898, Therese penned a series of letters to 2 French students training to be priests. And she was thrilled to have what she called these brothers. She'd lost her own brothers in childhood, and she was really overjoyed at different times when she was given these 2 students to write to and to befriend and to become their spiritual sister. And she creates a tremendous bond of prayer and spirituality with them. It's very uplifting. To one of them, who later became a priest, Père Adolphe Rouland, she writes, "My weapon is love and suffering, whereas your sword is that of the word and of apostolic words." Towards the end of her life, she will write, "Farewell, my brother. Distance will never be able to separate our souls. Even death will render our union more intimate." The other man who later became priest was the Abbé Bellier. There are books written about him and her correspondence with Therese. I recommend. Since she was a child, Therese sought to find her place in God's plan, her mission in life as well. And when she entered Carmel, she sought to follow God's path for her, even in the enclosure. Therese wrote that for as long as she could remember, she always had deep yearnings and desires to follow God, and passionately believed that God alone would fulfill them. Well, in the Carmel, during these years of being a young nun, she found her specific mission and the answer to her prayers. In the first letter of St Paul to the Corinthians, chapters 12 and 13, that's about the mystical body of Christ, the different parts, all contributing to the building up of the Christian church and the body of Christ with Christ at its head. You know, an arm, a weapon, the feet, and the armor that one wears as well. She realized that for the whole body to work, it needed a heart full of love to keep it working, to keep the ear, the eye, the muscles, the legs. You needed a heart to keep all that together. And she also realized that without a loving heart, there would be no preaching, there'd be no martyrs. I saw and I realized, she wrote, that love sets off the bounds of all vocations, that love is everything, that same love embraces every time and every place. In other words, that love is everlasting. Oh Jesus, my love, at last I have found my calling. My calling is love. I have found my place in the church, and you gave me that place. So, very quickly, just to say, Therese did not enter the convent for an easy life. She saw herself as a warrior, like her heroine, Joan of Arc, another woman with a mission. Using a modern example, we could say that Therese joined the commandos of the Marine Battalion, and she meant to avail of all the training needed and every ounce of her energy to serving the Jesus that she loved. Only for her, her training and her battles were inside herself and within her community. Here she served Jesus through serving others and wanted to extend his kingdom of love by living a life of sacrifice and prayer for a wider world, but all within the restricted physical enclosure of the convent, with companions she did not choose, but God gave her.